Welcome to See You on the Other Side, where the world of the mysterious collides with the world of entertainment. A discussion of art, music, movies, spirituality, the weird, and self-discovery. And now, your hosts, musicians and entertainers who have their own weakness for the weird, Mike and Wendy from the band Sunspot.
Well, Wendy, it's fun to come on back and talk to everybody after we played at a place with a little piece of pop culture.
Yes, indeed.
That's my alliteration for the week, actually.
Yes. And while we were there, we turned it up to 11, didn't we?
We did. We certainly did. This one goes to 11. And it did. We were at Shank Hall in Milwaukee this weekend. And why that is fun is because in the movie This Is Spinal Tap, which is one of our favorites, they're supposed to play at a fictitious club in Milwaukee named Shank Hall.
Right.
And the owner of the bar Shank Hall in Milwaukee, he used to book the UWM Ballroom in the 1980s. And he booked Spinal Tap there. And,
awesome.
And he said if they would ever open a club in Milwaukee, he'd name it Shank Hall. And then he did that in 1989.
What a cool idea.
Yeah. And so they didn't end up ever playing Shank Hall, but they did do a press conference there in 1992. So Christopher Guest and, I can't remember, Hank Shearer and Michael McKean. Michael McKean, who's got a connection to Milwaukee anyway, because he was Lenny from Laverne and Shirley.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, that's pretty cool, making fiction into reality.
Yeah,
you know?
Right.
Taking that part of the movie and making it a thing, and then our band got to play at it. So
yes, and so we were there this weekend, this Friday.
A couple degrees away from Spinal Tap, Mike.
Yeah, we're working on it. Like I was gonna say, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Right. But we had a great time, and congratulations to our friends in the band Well Known Strangers who had their EP release party that night.
Yeah.
It was a good time.
Sounded
Milwaukee's
good.
Always a great time.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks to everyone who came out to that show.
Yes. We didn't find any ghost stories, but we did have a little pop culture story for you, so that was a lot of fun. And we are going to be talking about things like that, pop culture, ghost stories, cool other things like that, at the Patreon Hangout this Wednesday. That is May 9th.
Yes. And don't forget, if you are coming to that, if you have time to tune into an episode of Ghosts in the Hood. Last week we decided that would be our fun little project for the week to have something to talk about, new to most of us. So I watched a little bit of it last night. Mike, have you?
I'm saving it up. It up for tomorrow big. So I'm all prepared for
and I will
for the
not
hangout.
spoil it then. I will
Excellent.
not spoil it.
But that's the thing. So part of our Patreon community, and if you guys need to check that out, you can check it out at othersidepodcast.com/donate. We get together with a hangout every month, and we talk about paranormal stuff. So, and this week is TV Show Club. But we love to hang out with the people that listen to the podcast regularly and want to support it. And you guys can become part of that at othersidepodcast.com/donate. And we hope to hang out with you this Wednesday.
Yes.
You know what else happens this Wednesday, Wendy?
What happens?
Well, Dr. Jack Hunter's new book, Engaging the Anomalous, collected essays on anthropology, the paranormal, mediumship, and extraordinary experience, comes out.
Right up our alley here at See You on the Other Side.
Yeah, and it's cool because it's being published by the same company that did UFOs Reframing the Debate. That's Robbie Graham's book.
Oh,
He
yeah.
featured in a 2-part interview last fall.
Yes.
What I really like about this book, and I've had a chance to preview it and browse through it and get through a lot of it most of this weekend, was that it's nice to see a book that talks about paranormal experiences with like a bibliography, with like a works cited. Like it can go in and say, came from this journal, it came from this article, it came from... So you're a lot of times you're just reading about this stuff on the internet or, in some book that...
Or it's just anecdotal.
Right, where they don't care about citing the works in the past and going through, and that's the beautiful thing about academic stuff, is that it has to.
Yep.
And so Jack really has done his research here, and in the interview he's going to give us some cool stories about anthropologists, what they've seen, like paranormal stuff, some of his own experience, and then just a little bit about how we can approach studying paranormal stuff, investigating it ourselves from a more holistic perspective than just like going through and saying, oh, I know what this is just all in your head, or I know what this is, even just saying I know what this is, it's all ghosts.
Right. Well, I can't wait to hear it. So why don't we get right to the interview?
All right. What's up, Doc? Dr. Jack Hunter is an anthropologist in the United Kingdom, also the editor and founder of the online journal Paranormal, the journal of anthropological approaches to the paranormal. His new book is a collection of essays entitled Engaging the Anomalous, and it's available starting this Wednesday. Jack joins Allison and I today. He's in the UK. We're in Wisco. Jack, how you doing, man?
Good, thanks. How are you doing?
Yay, Jack! So glad to have you back on.
Dr. Jack, we can call him now since
Dr. Jack, that's right.
I feel like we've been there since the beginning of his evolution. from non-doctor to doctor.
Yeah.
So wonderful.
Yeah, so congratulations on that. That's probably, I heard it's pretty easy, right?
Yeah, it's pretpretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Just show up every day.
Yeah.
It's like as long as you pay your tuition, right? No, I know what kind of thing it can be. You wrote this new book, Engaging the Anomalous, as in parallel to your doctoral thesis.
Yep, pretty much. The thesis actually contains a lot of the chapters in this book, but kind of expanded and developed. So basically, I wrote the chapters in this book over the last 7 years or so.
Yeah, and it's so wide ranging. There's just so much in there. So, we might have to have you back again because I just don't know how we're going to cover it all, but, so you're an anthropologist, and I think, what we really want to get to is I know you've been inspired by others to take this path, other anthropologists who experienced extraordinary things. And I think our audience really wants to hear, what are some of those extraordinary experiences that have so far, eluded attempts to be explained away, and who are these people who've studied these things?
Well, when you think about anthropologists, let's get out there. So we have this idea of an anthropologist who is living in the jungle or whatever with some tribe, taking notes and stuff like that, and maybe peyote or whatever. But the idea of the anthropologist, so like, who, what was when you talk about the inspiration and things that might have happened to some of these people? Also, let's make sure we talk about the context. Did it happen while they were on location? Were they, doing some research? Because I think that also adds something to the story, a little bit to the story as well.
Yeah. That's a vital aspect of it. When I first decided that I wanted to start researching the paranormal from an anthropological perspective, I did as much kind of background reading as I possibly could. I wanted to find out for how long anthropologists have been engaging with these things. And then ultimately what I wanted to do, and this is a big part of the book, but it's also a big part of my thesis as well, is kind of mapping out the history of anthropology's engagement with the paranormal. And actually, I was surprised to find that anthropologists have been interested in the paranormal going right very beginnings of the discipline in the middle of the 19th century. So actually, anthropology has been involved with the paranormal for about 150 years.
So what kind of stuff would they do back then? You know what I mean? Like if they were going that far, and we tend to think of, when we think of studying the paranormal, we think of people with the ping pong balls over their eyes, or you think of the Zehner deck from Ghostbusters. So when they were kind of either documenting the phenomena or doing it, what were some of the situations that they'd find themselves in?
So one of the earliest anthropologists to really think about the paranormal seriously was actually Sir E.B. Tylor, who was is actually one of the founding fathers of anthropology. And he was the first chair in anthropology at Oxford University as well. So, he is pretty much the first anthropologist. And he did a bit of field work in Mexico and things. But when he was specifically thinking about mediumship, obviously he was working around about the same time that the spiritualist movement really kicked off. And what he did, obviously there was a really big craze for it and everyone was loving it. So he decided that he was going to go along and attend some seances. And he attended seances with some of the Victorian era's kind of most well-known and well-respected mediums. So he sat with Kate Fox, for example, who was one of the first, one of the Fox sisters.
Oh, yeah. Right.
He sat with her in London. He sat with D.D. Hume, who was a really, really important medium. He seemed to be able to do a lot of different kinds of things, levitations and all sorts of crazy stuff. And he sat with the Reverend Stanton Moses as well. So what he did basically, he wrote about his experiences with them, and in his private diaries, basically, he said that he'd seen things that he didn't think he could explain rationally. Okay, but he kept these ideas private, and he didn't publish them in his mainstream kind of publications, where actually he was pretty much anti-spiritualism. So it's interesting with this first character early on in the history of anthropology, he had a personal fascination, he had personal experiences that challenged his worldview, but in public, he stuck with the kind of status quo, with the like a hardcore evolutionist materialist view.
And that's funny to me. That makes me think about, so that's just part of human nature. When I think about the televangelists, like that are so religious and so holy and all like that, and they all get caught with hookers. Like nobody escapes the getting caught with hookers at some point in time, and they're talking about family values and talking about all this, but they have a secret fascination with getting some on the side. And in science, it's except for sex, it's like, oh, I like to dabble in spirituality.
Yeah, exactly, it is. And that was one of the things that I wanted to do when I started the Paranormal Journal, was to make a place where people who had that kind of secret interest, where they could actually talk about it, amongst people who are going to take them seriously, and foster that interest and see where it leads.
So I know when you were writing, some of the experiences that you talked about were what we're used to, a little bit more Western influenced, but were extraordinarily things also experienced by anthropologists in non-Western settings, in maybe some cultures that we might not be as familiar with?
Yeah, definitely. And that's one of the most interesting things about anthropology, and where anthropology can have this kind of expanding perspective on the paranormal, because anthropologists, obviously we have anthropologists who might deal with things that we're familiar with, Western spirit mediumship, Western religions and all those kinds of things, but we also have that extra comparative data from non-Western societies and indigenous cultures and different traditions.
Well, when you're talking about E.B. Tyler, and and maybe this goes for any of the different people that have done studies. So take a guy like you said, he's down there working in Mexico, places like that, with these non-Western cultures, and then comes back and starts doing spiritualist stuff. Did he do any writing or anything like that about how comparing how they did stuff in the non-Western and the Western culture?
Well, yeah, he did. One of the thing that Tyler's most famous for really is his concept of animism. We've heard of animism as a belief in spirits and all those kinds of things, and it is a term that Tyler introduced into kind of the intellectual circle. And Tyler didn't see any difference between the kinds of things that were being practiced, the kind of magico religious practices that were taking place in Mexico, for example, and the kinds of practices the spiritualists were doing in London at the time.
Well, when I think animism, I think, please correct me if I'm wrong, because it's been a long time since college and I did not pay that much attention. But, when I think of animism, I think of, we believe that the trees have some kind of consciousness, that the river, that the environment has a consciousness around us, that everything has some kind of spirit associated with it. Am I way off here? Or
No, that's exactly it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and Tyler was the first person to like, from an anthropological perspective, to point that out, and he argued that it was the very foundational definition of religion. So he said, if we look at religion and break it down to its most fundamental parts, what we find is belief in spirits. So he was really equating the high religions like Catholicism and Judaism and all of the big religions. He was equating those with these lower, well, in his terms, lower indigenous traditions. So we've also got to bear in mind the fact that he was working within this kind of broadly evolutionist framework, where there were savages, and then there was high culture.
Right, the sun never sets on the British Empire.
Yeah, exactly. So part of what he was trying to do was to kind of bring down religion by associating it with these primitive beliefs, which is
I see.
See what I mean? Yeah.
So, could we get into some stories of anthropologists that you've read about that inspired you, and what were some details of cases that they investigated in maybe far-flung areas that show us the universality of paranormal experience?
Well, there's one anthropologist who I'll talk about two anthropologists, because there's two particular anthropologists that give a good view of both sides of the spectrum. And we're moving on.
And because if there's something better than one anthropologist, it's two anthropologists.
Exactly. Yeah. So we'll jump forwards a few decades from E.B. Tyler and just have a little think about a guy called Sir E.E. Evans Pritchard. And again, Evans Pritchard is a really significant figure in anthropology. He did a lot of really influential books. One of his most famous books is called Witchcraft, Oracles and Magic Among the Azandi. And it's about the Azandi people in Sudan, and about their witchcraft beliefs and all these kinds of things. And kind of hidden, it's actually quite early on in the book, but hidden in the book, he references this experience he had while he was, one night he went outside of his hut, he was staying in part of the village, and he saw this, a disembodied light floating through the bush. And he followed it some way and then eventually lost track of it. And when he went back to tell the villagers what he'd seen, they said, well, that was definitely witchcraft. You've definitely seen witchcraft. And then, so he writes about it in his book. And then, again, we're moving one step further away from Tyler. So Tyler had these kinds of experiences, but didn't write about them in public. E.B. Tyler does write about them in public. Evans Pritchard does write about them in public. But then he goes on to say that it was probably just some grass lit by someone on their way to defecate. So he kind of like...
As you do.
Yeah, he turns it into a little bit of a toilet joke. And it's this constant tension between, the experiences that people actually have in the field, and then telling people about those experiences without making yourself look crazy or as if you've gone native.
Yeah, and so you feel like you have to debase it in some way.
Yeah.
As to what you were saying about make it some kind of toilet humor to take away its significance.
Exactly.
And before we get off that, because I want to hear about the other anthropologist that you mentioned as well, but you mentioned seeing, like an orb of light.
Me personally, or Evans Pritchard?
Evans Pritchard.
Yeah.
But I wanted to kind of relate that, because a lot of our listenership is going to come from like a paranormal investigative background, where the dominant conversation right now is about orbs.
Yeah.
And so I used to dispense with that, because I know that on film, orbs can be caused by so many things.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people just use it as automatic confirmation of spirits when they pick anything up on a camera. And it's, I want to be sensitive to people's experience, but I also have to make clear that, hey, look, there's a lot of other things that this could be. But then I go and have
when it comes to orbs, I'm definitely not sensitive. Film, I'm definitely not sensitive to other people's experiences.
But then I get kind of a kick in the pants from the universe, or that's how I interpret it, when I went to a location that I was like, this place is not haunted, right? And I didn't expect, it wasn't like I was priming myself, or I was, oh yes, I'm going to see something tonight. In fact, it was the exact opposite. I had to put on a 2-hour presentation. That's what I was focused on. And then at the end of that, I'm just stowing my stuff away. And what do I see but a quarter-sized white sphere of light, or I guess light. I mean, it wasn't like gleaming or anything like that, but it's this quarter-sized sphere of white coming towards me from across the room, which flicks across the right side of my head. Like so close, I felt like it was going to touch me.
Yeah.
And what is that, right? So, okay, so that's the dominant culture sees these orbs, typically white orbs of light. And so I saw it with my own eyes. So now I have to be like, well, I can't just throw that out.
That's it.
What was that?
As soon as you have that experience, it opens up the possibility.
I know, right? I just, And I didn't even tell Mike that night, even though I was with him. I was with all kinds of people interviewing me, doing a paranormal investigation. I wasn't like, hey guys, I just saw an orb.
Yeah.
It was so, I don't know what happened exactly, but I'm going back and thinking it was so off-putting to me that I needed time to process it. And so I didn't talk to anybody about it until that was Saturday, until that next Monday after work. I called Mike and I was like, well, actually, I did see something. And
right. And we all were like, because we're like, there's some fun stories about the place,
Right.
but we're like, this is not crawling with
right,
ghosts.
this is some dog and pony paranormal show. This is, that's what my feeling was of the place. And then I have this.
And then Allison has a scoop.
Yeah, and like me, I have an experience, because I'm like nothing. I feel like nothing ever happens to me. Well, things do happen, but like 16 years apart and stuff like that, and they take like a second and then they're gone. But the idea here is, and then too later on, months later, somebody else is talking about their experience independent of me, and they had practically an identical experience with an orb coming across the room and like flying past their head.
Yes.
And then I didn't tell them about it. So it was really kind of unusual. So, but what I want to get to, there's a lot of things in what I just said, but what I'm really trying to get to is, okay, so we have this limited view of seeing these orbs, but then I teach at a Native American school. So whenever the opportunity presents, I do a sweat lodge. And I have heard stories for many years of people seeing lights in the sweat lodge, and they will describe them in a very different way. They're not these white orbs, but instead they're kind of like starburst, like multi-colored sparks of light that and are recognized as spirits by people in the sweat lodge. Now, unfortunately, I haven't seen them with my own eyes, but it was just interesting to me to note the way different spirits present.
Yeah.
Like they're noticing those as spirits, and then the dominant culture notices these white these white spherical shapes.
Yeah, it is interesting when we talk thinking about like universal characteristics of experiences and things. The fact that you can have an experience of seeing an orb, in I don't know where you were, in Wisconsin or whatever. You can have
in Wisconsin.
You can have Native American people experiencing orbs in their sweat lodges, and then I myself could have the experience of little flashing lights flying around in a seance in Bristol. So there seems to be something, something going on there that's more than just cultural. I mean, we layer our cultural interpretations on it, but at the end of the day, it's just people seeing balls of light or little flashes, isn't it?
Right, and it's Evans Pritchard seeing it in
in the 1920s.
And so when we didn't have like drones.
Yeah.
Or things like that, because really what you saw, Allison, was an NSA camera.
Oh, it was? I thought it was swamp gas.
They usually fly past there. It's the deep state. They want to know what they really give a damn about ghost hunters. But let's hear.
Let's hear some more stories. Sorry, Jack.
Yeah, well, the other anthropologist I was going to mention was actually probably an anthropologist who's had maybe the biggest influence on me, and that's Edith Turner. I can't remember actually if I talked about her on the last time I did an interview with you, but I'll go over it.
But that's okay. Yeah. We can go for Edith again.
She was really great. The experience that she had that most inspired me was when she was working with the Ndembu in Zambia, and she participated in this ritual called the Ihamba ceremony. And she basically the purpose of the ritual is to extract this malignant spirit that's entered into the body of the afflicted patient. So it's kind of like a spirit possession kind of thing. And they do this ritual, which is a long, like very physical, like dancing and clapping and getting involved. So she had previously witnessed this ritual before with her husband, like 20, 30 years earlier. And then after he died, she'd gone back to the field again to participate. And this time she let herself flow with the ritual and really allow it to move her. And then at the climax of the ritual, again, we're talking about these kinds of blobs of energy or something, but she witnessed this, she described it as a grey kind of plasma-like blob being extracted from the back of the patient. And she saw it clearly with her own eyes, and in her writing about it, she describes it so vividly. and the other members of the ritual also saw it. So she saw this as a point of kind of entry into their cosmology, into their life world, where she could have the same kinds of experiences as her informants were having. And then the really bold thing she then did about it was go ahead and write about it and publish it in an academic journal, as an ethnographic document.
Well, as a scientist, how do you not freak out? Like, maybe that's part of the job description is like needs to not freak out when seeing gray blobs out of the back of somebody. But how do you keep, I think about myself, and I've only had a couple of weird experiences in my life. And I kind of didn't freak out, but people with me freaked out. I freaked out a touch. But I think, I told everybody about it. I was slapping five. I'm like, I can't believe I had that experience. It's unbelievable. How does, I think about Edith Turner or whatever. She sees something that to me would be like, okay, here's proof of something out there. How do you keep your objectivity when you kind of just want to freak out and, high five all the natives?
I mean, how do you keep your objectivity? Is there such a thing as objectivity? And I think that's a part of what the role of the anthropologist really ought to be, is to report back accurately their experiences, no matter how subjective or objective. They're reporting back their experiences as a participant in that particular moment. And, that in itself, we should be able to treat that as valid scientific data. We should be at a point now where we can use someone's experiences, because we know most of the time people don't lie about these things. If you're an anthropologist, you're expected to be, you've been trained in an academic discipline. We've got to take these accounts from anthropologists seriously, really, I think.
I've recently, had conversations with people, a little bit more skeptical than maybe I am. I consider myself a true skeptic, but, on the spectrum of things, but, there's a little bit of people who are thought of as more typical skeptics, but are also open, that I've opened a discussion with. And, one of them said to me that, when I reported that orb story to him and was like, what just happened? I really just wanted to talk about it. Because I wasn't expecting to see that. Obviously I didn't talk to anybody about it, until that Monday after.
Yeah.
It was really startling for me and embarrassing too, because it's like, here's a place where I'm like, if there's any place that's not haunted, it's this place. Yeah. And, the other thing is, I don't want to see an orb. It just seemed like I'm going to tell people and this is going to mark me. So, I mean, it has characteristics which I didn't want to deal with. If I had to choose something to see, it wouldn't have been that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, because this podcast is not a safe space for orb
Well,
stories.
I just mean that, when I talked to a skeptic about it, he said, well, I've learned not to trust my senses. And I can understand that idea to a point, because, we all know there's lots of illusions out there, optical and otherwise. And so we have to be aware that, sometimes what we see or what we experience is, maybe not as accurate as we'd like. And that is part of the condition altogether, because we have so much sensory input coming in and we're not addressing it all. But, I just wanted to see what you thought about that, because what I thought about that is, well, dude, if you don't trust your senses, I mean, if none of us ever trusted our senses, we wouldn't have any data for science to grow out of.
Exactly. So I think there's a couple of interesting issues to unpack with this. First of all, going back to your experience and how you say that you weren't anticipating that kind of experience. If you were going to choose to have an experience, then you wouldn't choose to have the experience of an orb, for example. So it's interesting how there's this interplay between belief and expectation. Okay, so we know that if you believe more in psi, for example, then you show greater psi effect in the lab. So we know there's a role of belief, but there's also something that is kind of like unpredictable. There's still a kernel of something that's that seems to be independent of our belief and expectation. So obviously you weren't expecting anything, and if you were expecting something, it wouldn't have been an orb, and yet you still see it. You see an orb. So there seems to be something more than just belief and expectation. So that's one thing. And then the other thing that I find interesting, this is actually something that came up in my my Viva for my PhD, was this idea about whether we can actually experience reality firsthand. Okay, so one of my examiners, Angela Voss, brought up the fact that this idea that we can't perceive reality directly comes from the philosopher Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant basically said in the 18th century that there is this world called the noumenal world, and then there is a world called the phenomenal world. The noumenal world is the world that we can never gain access to, because we always come at it through our own physical bodies and through our cultural concepts and all those kinds of things. So we only ever gain a grasp of the phenomenal world. Okay, but really this is just an assumption. And if we look at a lot of different traditions, maybe other kinds of indigenous traditions or esoteric traditions or any other kind of tradition that doesn't rely on Kant, then they believe that it is possible that we can have direct experience of the world. So what I'm interested in, for example, is what our direct experience of consciousness, for example, can tell us about consciousness itself. And what I'm saying is that we don't have to be, there's room for subjectivity in science. I think that's where I'm going. And that we can have accurate observations of the real world, because we are enmeshed within the real world. I don't know if I've gone off on a tangent there, but
No. I like it. And I first of all, Kant is in the guy's name. I prefer Immanuel Kant.
Exactly.
But no, but that idea that, I mean, of course, there needs to be room for some kind of subjectivity in science. And the reason it does is because when we act like everything's objective and you don't include the context of the scientist, the observer, the person doing it, then I feel like then the results are more open to either manipulation or, and especially in this day and age where different media outlets will manipulate whatever they can find to be more advantageous to whoever's paying their bills. That's the nature of the world, and that's okay. It's what we have to deal with. But also, I mean, that's why when you're looking at research, and that's why journals look at the context of the experiment, and that's why you have it to be accredited, and you have people peer review it before it goes on to try and do that. Like you were saying before, anthropologists go out there and they're trained for years to not lose their crap when something magical happens to them on location. And we should trust in a little bit that what they're telling us actually happened to them, and they're just reporting it to the best of their ability.
Or even if it's not the whole picture that we get from their report, we can at least say that something happened, because there would be no point in writing about it if it hadn't, unless you're totally faking the whole thing.
Right. In order to get in a journal or to get a speaking tour or a book deal or something. It's
interesting though, because the climate against talking about these things in academia is really strong. So for an anthropologist or for a scholar to actually persevere and want to get their story published in that way suggests that there's more to it, that there's a reason that they want to have these stories published in an academic journal. And it's amazing when they actually do make it through. And there are so many. When you start to research, as I found over the last 7 years, there's so many anthropologists who reported these strange experiences. And all that really differs is the extent to which each anthropologist is happy about talking about it in public.
Sure. Well, something I was thinking about when I was browsing through the book, is there a particular essay or thing that you have in there that you may be the most proud of, or you think encapsulates your worldview, or, what's your favorite chapter when you're like, oh man, like what's the single, what's the hit single out of Engaging the Anomalous?
Oh, that's a good question. I think really the first couple of chapters are really useful. because they're the chapters that lay out the history of anthropology's engagement with the paranormal. So if you read those, then you slowly build up a good picture of how anthropology has dealt with the paranormal. So I think those first 2 chapters are really useful. They also touch on the idea of ontological flooding, which I've been toying with, and which actually you wrote a song about.
That's right. So let's hear. But those of us that might not remember, or anybody in the audience who hasn't listened to that episode yet, let's go through your idea of ontological flooding, because I think it's a cool one.
Yeah. So basically, it's an idea that emerged from my observation that in the social sciences, so in anthropology, religious studies, psychology, they tend to try and put a bracket around issues of ontology, so questions about whether things actually exist or not. So for a mainstream sociologist or a mainstream anthropologist, they might study something like religious beliefs, for example, without necessarily asking whether God really exists or whether the things that they believe in really exist. So they put brackets around that question so they don't have to deal with it, and then they get on with the much easier task of dealing with belief and how people believe and how people think about things without wondering about whether these things are actually real. So my idea is that if you get rid of those brackets and then face up to the question of ontology directly and playfully engage with it in that way, then you should be able to move into kind of more fruitful areas of inquiry and investigation. So that's basically the idea. Yeah.
When it comes to ontological flooding and using that, what kind of example would you been maybe that you've seen in anthropologists, or you yourself? What's a good example of something that's happened to you when you've been out there doing research? I know you've done a ton of research into mediumship, and is there anything maybe in that area where you can give the layman like me a little more concrete example?
Basically, with my idea of ontological flooding, it means that as an anthropologist or as an ethnographer, or just as anyone who's going into a situation and experiencing it directly, that you have to be open to multiple possible influencing factors. And that might also include multiple different explanatory theories as well. So a really good example that I use, and that is kind of the core of my thesis in a way, is spirit mediumship. So for example, if you look at spirit mediumship around the world, and then you look at the kind of the anthropological and psychological theories and explanations for it, then you generally end up with 2 or 3 key ideas. Either that spirit possession is some kind of pathology, some kind of a neurological problem, or it's to do with some kind of illness or disease.
Okay, so with that thought right there, so the idea that spiritual possession, and when we're talking about mediumship, we mean like when the medium. So if you get the idea, it's like when Demi Moore was talking through Whoopi Goldberg in Ghost, right?
Yeah,
so it's like you are possessed, not necessarily in the Exorcist demonic possession, but you're possessed in the way of the spirit is talking through you.
Yeah, that's something I should make clear, because in the kind of the paranormal community, when we talk about spirit possession, you probably think of like the Exorcist or something like that. Whereas in anthropology, spirit possession is a much more kind of general term that applies to different kinds of mediumship traditions, and basically any kind of tradition where the medium or the individual incorporates the spirit into their body. So it could be negative, and a lot of people do associate spirit possession with with negative demons and things infecting their bodies. But spirit possession from an anthropological perspective can also include mediumship as well. So I understand that can be a bit confusing, but that's what I mean.
Right. And so the idea that there's a like you said, like a pathology associated with it. There's something wrong with you if you think you're possessed by a spirit. That's one possible explanation.
Yeah, or there's something wrong with you if you go into a trance or things like that. And these are popular explanations as well. So a lot of people would tend to think that that's the case. Okay, so that's one kind of explanation. Another explanation is that it is some kind of a cognitive misfiring, or if there's something wrong either wrong in the way that people are thinking about things, or people are thinking about things, they're using processes of thinking that apply to one situation and are trying to apply it to another one, and that results in a kind of an error. so they have an anomalous experience. Okay, that's like the cognitive explanation. It's similar to when you think about pareidolia and things like that, where you think that you see a face in a tree, and actually it's just your brain kind of concocting that face.
Sure. When Alice and I grew up, we had a stone over the fireplace that looked exactly like William Shakespeare, and we all saw it. Like anybody who was over there was like, "That,
so true.
That is William Shakespeare."
Yeah.
And without even pointing it out to each other, whatever, you all saw it. So I like to call that explanation the Shakespeare explanation of spirit possession.
Exactly. Yeah, that's it. So the idea is that, we should naturally pick up on faces in the environment anyway, because it's good for us to be able to spot predators and all those kinds of things. So when we have an anomalous experience like that, we're just we're misplacing one cognitive process onto another one. So we're using an otherwise useful cognitive process on a rock or on a tree. Okay, but that's a very reductive way of thinking about things. So far we've got pathology, cognitive illusions. There are other ones like some anthropologists might interpret spirit mediumship purely as a performance, so as a kind of a dance, and they would put it on the same kind of level as other kinds of cultural performances. Or some anthropologists interpret spirit possession and mediumship as a form of protest, for example. So people who have a lower status might practice mediumship because when they're possessed or ostensibly possessed by a spirit, it gives them a higher social status. Okay, so you have all of these different kinds of theories and explanations of mediumship, and each one of them tends to think that they've kind of sorted it all out already. So the social protest guys say, right, yeah, we've sorted spirit possession out. It's basically just a form of social protest. The cognitive guys say, we've sorted spirit possession out. All it is a cognitive illusion. And the pathological guys say, we've sorted it all out. It's just illness. It's some kind of brain disorder.
But none of those explanations involve ghosts going into your body, and that's my preferred explanation.
Exactly. And none of those explanations touch on the kind of parapsychological evidence, in which there is a lot of evidence that certain individuals are able to do certain strange things, like even in laboratory conditions. So where ontological flooding comes in is that we have all of these different explanations on the table, and instead of assuming that we can pick one and that's going to provide us with a happy, full, complete explanation, we have to be open to all of them simultaneously, as well as others. So, for example, we have to be open to the possibility that there may be real spirits involved. We have to be open to the possibility that it might be some kind of illness, or we have to be open to the possibility that there is some kind of like a social functional protest kind of thing going on. And actually, in reality, it's all of these things, mixing together at the same time that give rise to the experience as a whole. So ontological flooding really means that we have to take seriously how complex it is, and not try and explain it in terms that are too simple. Do you see what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. And, I was trying to think of, especially when we're talking about mediumship, spirit possession. We think of the seance,
Mm-hmm.
we think of ectoplasm, we think of manifestations of a ghost like popping out of the closet, raps on the desk and things. And so when you were doing research, and I know you talk about this in the book too, Engaging the Anomalous, out this Wednesday, everybody. But you talk about this in the book. What kind of seances and stuff did you go to? And was there any, stuff happens there, but was there anything that you were like, oh man, I never thought this would happen to me, or something like that? Because we've all been to so many ghost hunts and events and things like that. And a lot of times it's a big fat nothing burger. Yeah. So when something does happen, it's shocking in a way. It's like, holy crap, something's going on here that I don't quite get. Yeah. And so I just, what was one of those things that happened to you? And then when you put your anthropologist hat on, and I think of it as like a deer stalker cap is what you're going to use as your anthropologist. I mean, whatever hat could be a wide brim, could be a Panama Jack. I'm not sure. Yeah, the fedora, perfecto. So what kind of happened? And then what did you, when you put the anthropologist part on, what were the different ways you were looking at what you think you might have saw?
Well, and again, I can't remember if I talked about this before or not, but the key for me, the most important experience that I had during my field work was, and it only happened a couple of times, quite early on, but it was when my hand actually seemed to be possessed. I can't remember again, like if I already talked about this or not.
No, hand possession is good all the time.
So it was one session where the medium couldn't turn up. So they decided they were going to do like an open development sitting, and anyone who was in the room would be in a meditative state, and they would say like, spirits, we're allowing you to let yourselves be known through anyone in the room. So it was kind of opening ourselves, the whole group, up to the spirits. And, I wasn't expecting anything particularly unusual was going to happen. I was just thinking of it as a meditation, or some kind of an opportunity to relax and listen to the music in the warm seance room, and they'd dim the lights down and everyone would just sit there and meditate. But as I was doing this, I felt that my heart rate started to increase, and I felt like a tingling in my hands, like when you get pins and needles in your hands. And then all of a sudden my left hand started to move of its own accord. It was a really strange state, because I felt I could feel my body doing things that I wasn't willing it to do, and I was aware of the fact. So it was almost as though I was observing my own body doing something that I knew I wasn't doing. And the reason this was such an important experience for me is because it gave me that extra experiential insight into what it feels like to allow spirits to move into your body, to allow yourself to be overtaken by spirits. So that was probably the weirdest experience I had, and also the most important as an anthropologist, because it helped me to understand.
Let's break that down, though. Okay, so you felt like you lost control of your hand. What are three different scientific there's number one, the idea that a spirit could have came in, took over your hand, be like, well, sweet, it's, this is it's a hand party, it's Evil Dead 2. And then, like, what are some other aspects you could approach it?
So another aspect could be, for example, some kind of a dissociative state. So perhaps I had entered into, because dissociation is something that they talk about in psychiatry, where we kind of have this capacity to distance ourselves from our bodies. So, for example, in times of stress or times of trauma, it might be, kind of like useful for us to be able to separate ourselves from our body in some way. Okay, that can be taken either way. You could see that as a complete explanation. So he just had a kind of dissociative episode, and that's what happened. Or you could take it, which is perhaps where I'm going with my idea of ontological flooding, that dissociation is a part of a wider process of allowing spirits to make themselves known through your body, possibly. Okay, so that's another explanation. And then I suppose the third one could be that I'm just making the whole thing up.
Right, that you wanted a cool story for your book.
Yeah, exactly. That I wanted a cool story to write about it was my undergraduate dissertation at the time.
Well, I'm going to interject right here and just say that, so this ontological flooding that you're talking about, I love the idea of, the accuracy of it, because, it's I think it's cross-disciplinary, it's holistic, and it's like there's that little story that of blind people in a room, and there's an elephant in there with them, right? Yes. And then, one person is feeling, this just came to mind. I don't even know how it goes, but, one person has the tail in their hand. It's like, it's like I don't know, it's like a broom, it's like a brush. And then somebody else has the trunk, and they're like, what is this thing? It's like a vacuum cleaner, and the other one has, like a tusk. Oh no, it's like a dagger, right? There's so many, everybody's just like taking a piece of it, and nobody is getting that it's an elephant.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like everyone is so focused on their specific kind of explanation that they fail to see the kind of bigger picture, and how all the different ideas that people are coming up with touching different parts of the elephant. If we take them all together and put them together, then we get a more complete image of what's going on, rather than thinking that it is just a broom, or it is just a snake, or whatever it is. That's what ontological flooding is. It's taking the whole elephant for itself
just one more thing.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed that you mentioned Margaret Mead in your book, and if there's any
Yeah,
real anthropologist that has name recognition, I think it's Margaret Mead. And
definitely. Yeah.
and so I just wanted to know, like, what was her experience with all of this? I mean, what were her conclusions about the reality of people's experience?
Margaret Mead is obviously she is one of the biggest names in anthropology, but it's also a little known fact that if it wasn't for Margaret Mead, the Parapsychological Association would never have become a member of the American Academy of Sciences.
What?
It was actually, yeah, it was Margaret Mead's kind of clout as a well-respected anthropologist and her support for parapsychological research that ultimately gave the Parapsychological Association enough kind of credence to become a member of the AAS. So yeah, she was a big influence on it, and she'd done parapsychological experiments with a parapsychologist called Gardner Murphy. She'd done those classic Zenacard experiments, and she'd been, to her mind anyway, it had been demonstrated that we do have some kind of a telepathic ability. So she was particularly interested in what she said was she was interested in exploring the kind of psychodynamics behind psychic sensitives. So the psychological and all the different factors that enable psychic sensitives to be so psychically sensitive.
Now, when we're talking about psychic sensitives, the first thing that we always think of, or at least that I always think of, and take me as the average Western culture layman, would be, okay, well, psychic sensitive would be like a shaman, or that, right? And so if you take a shaman in indigenous cultures, and I guess we're all indigenous to somewhere, but if you think of what we think of as non-Western indigenous cultures, and we take the shaman, do we find examples of individuals with kind of not necessarily superpowers, but some kind of advanced power from all different kinds of cultures? Like, we think of a shaman in one of Margaret Mead's tribes or whatever. Are there analogs all over all over the cultures of the world, from Western to?
Yes, there are, definitely.
And are there similar ways that they, like initiations, or that they go through to get to those superpowers?
Yeah, there are. This is one of the interesting things about it, because it's so tempting to say that, for example, the shaman in the Amazon is doing exactly the same thing as the spirit medium in London, or the spirit medium in Bristol or something, or that the Yaqui sorcerer is doing exactly the same thing as the voodoo priest. But I think really it's much more complicated than that. When we do look at them and we do compare cross-culturally, what we see is kind of key ideas that keep cropping up, or key techniques and processes. So although they have completely different kind of cultural baggage attached to them, they have completely different cosmologies and completely different interpretations, there are certain core things that everyone seems to use to get in touch with this invisible or spiritual world, or whatever we want to call it. So examples would be things like altered states of consciousness. So most magico-religious practitioners employ some kind of altered state of consciousness to make contact with this world. And then there are all of the different techniques that exist for people to put themselves into these altered states. So we get sensory deprivation and ingesting psychoactive substances, or some kind of hyperstimulation, or like physical exertion, or whatever. There are these key things that people use around the world. So it's not to say that they're all doing exactly the same thing, but they are using similar kinds of processes and similar kinds of techniques. They just pad around them with particular ideologies, really. So yeah.
And this brings to mind, I can't remember which culture it is, but apparently, I was reading like a year or so back about a culture that for the people who are becoming shamans in that group, they will take the children and that have been identified as having these skills, and they grow up in a cave in darkness.
Yeah.
Do you recall what I'm talking about, Jack?
Yeah, I do. I can't remember the name of the people at the moment, but I do know the story. And then
Yeah, well, I'll look that up too, because that they live for 12 plus years, maybe even more years, isolated from society, in this dark cave until they come out and experience the world
For real. Yes.
just for real, like a fresh perspective.
Well, that's like Professor X's
Right.
school for gifted children, but it sucks.
Well, it's just something that just really grabbed me, this idea of living in darkness, for your young life, for your childhood, maybe 12 to 18 years. I'll look that up so that we can put some more information about it in the show notes, because I know I have the article somewhere, probably under the bed. But I was just fascinated, by that, the lengths that some cultures go to.
Yeah, I think it's a really good idea, a good kind of illustration of ontological flooding as well. So you would spend all of that time in the cave. You'd be taught by your teachers what the world is like and all of these kinds of things. And then there comes a point where you have to step outside of the cave and see how it all fits together. And that's what they do. So they learn about the animals, and they learn about the trees, and they learn about the rivers, and they learn about the weather and all these kinds of things, kind of like, like we talk about book learning and things. And then when you go out into the real world, you see how actually all of these disparate pieces of knowledge that you've been given connect together in one holistic kind of system.
And that's that's a universal human thing, is that, when you think about people growing up to be monks or priests or anything, they enter the monastery, they enter the seminary from a young age, and then they have to go through this training and stuff like that to become, is in the spiritual tradition. And you think about that, seems to be a universal thing, is that it's grooming people. Like, we need to have spiritual leaders, and so we groom them to, create them, and across cultures too.
And it's interesting that we, in the Western world, we are not doing that so much anymore. I mean, it's not a part of our culture to have these special people who can give us information that we can't gain in any other way. And maybe that's somewhere, or at some point, maybe that's somewhere where our culture has kind of gone off the track and has become a little bit confused in some ways, maybe.
Well, think about it. Do you guys know anybody in your personal life that grew up to be a priest?
No.
Nope.
No, you don't. I mean, I've known one person in my entire life who said, "Yeah, I considered the seminary."
Yeah.
And nobody else. I mean, I know a lot of people who've got that reverendship in the Universal Life Church or whatever.
Yeah, that's
so
me.
they can marry people.
I'm a
right?
reverend.
Well, actually, I'm a Dudist priest. I forgot about that.
All right. Okay. And so we also have a priest in the Big
priest.
Lebowski tradition.
Yeah, and I became a reverend so I could perform the marriage ceremony as well. So
Do a marriage.
I forgot that.
But that idea with the 150 people, like if you think of all the people, they say 150 people, right? In your circle is what we're like, our mind can handle. And so you think of the 450 people we know together, and none of us know somebody that grew up to be a priest.
No.
In the Western tradition, as we would call it, then that's, I mean, what's the percentage of that? That's 0.0, 3% or whatever. And so that's just a funny thing. I think we were talking about shaman and how we're kind of losing that tradition in the West. And we absolutely are losing that tradition in the West.
Yeah.
And for good or for bad, that's just the way it is.
And maybe just losing spirituality as a whole and our connection to nature. Because I know you've done a lot of work on that as well, Jack. And, you've been very generous with your time, but we want to give you an opportunity to talk about how we go forward and how we can use these things like animism to make the world a better place, because I know you're very actively involved in that as well.
Yes, this is where I seem to be being drawn at the moment. I'm moving towards thinking about how to further contextualize the paranormal and all of these kinds of things that I've been thinking about into a wider kind of ecological perspective. So, for example, in my research with anthropology, what I've tried to do is show how the paranormal is enmeshed within cultures, that culture has an influence on the paranormal and all those kinds of things, that the paranormal is enmeshed within our biology, that our physical bodies have a role in all of that as well. and also that there is something else that we seem to be interacting with. And the next logical step for me seems to be then to locate all of those processes that I've been talking about within the wider systems of our planet, of ecology, of the plants and the animals and the wind and all of these kinds of things that we live in. But then also, I think once you start doing that and realizing how interconnected all these systems are, then it spreads out and out and out and out, and it continues on to like the multiverse and all those kinds of things. So the idea is to put the paranormal in its context as it occurs within nature, not as something that's separate from nature, but as something that is the kind of fundamental aspect of it.
So taking the super out of the supernatural.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or calling all of nature super, whichever way you want to think about it. So one idea that I've been toying with recently is, I don't know if you've ever come across the term the greening of religion, but the idea is that because this is something I talked about in a podcast the other day with Andy Letcher, as I've been recording these One School, One Planet podcasts recently. It's just half-hour episodes about ecology and permaculture. But he was saying how, on a pragmatic level, one of the best things we could try and do is try and convince the kind of global religions that we need to take ecology seriously and that we need to realize that we're a part of our ecological systems. And this is called the greening of religion. So we're trying to encourage, religionists to engage with ecology and to see how important it is that we, to realize that we're a part of this system. And I think we can do a similar kind of thing with the paranormal. And we know how extremely widespread and popular the paranormal is. So many people interested in it all around the world. Doesn't matter who you talk to, that people are interested in it, whether they don't believe in it or not. So I'm wondering now whether we might be able to kind of tap into that energy of the whole of the paranormal community and build in this wider, this deeper ecological context into our discussions, so that, when we go out to do our paranormal investigations and things, we're doing that within this deeper understanding that everything that's taking place in the world is taking place in nature. So I think that's something that I'm toying with the idea at the moment. I think an edited book might be a good way of exploring that with different perspectives from different writers. So that's something to look out for in the future. I'm going to try and get that off the ground.
Sure.
Well, any way we can help, let us know, because that sounds like something that we would really support wholeheartedly.
Well, everybody hates pollution.
Yeah.
And everybody hates litter.
Yep.
And so if we find ways to make it paranormally advantageous to not pollute and not litter, we're always up for doing that. And I think it's a great idea. And so where can people listen to your podcast, Jack?
So it's on YouTube as well. So that's probably the easiest way to find it. If you just type in One School, One Planet on YouTube, we've got 6 episodes up there at the moment. And the podcast is about permaculture, ecology, and education, because I'm involved in this educational project to try and develop a permaculture textbook for secondary schools. But our conversations, because of my own background and my own interests, our conversations get a little bit cosmic at times. And
well, sure,
which is good. And we've been interviewing people. We interviewed a theologian at Chester Cathedral about permaculture and how she's been trying to bring permaculture into the church there. And I also interviewed, like I said earlier, Dr. Andy Letcher, who's teaching a new master's course in ecology and spirituality. So there is a lot of scope for thinking about these things. And this is just one thing that I've been thinking about as well. How we think like ecology and spirituality, and then ecology and the paranormal sounds like something that shouldn't go together. But I think they should. And the paranormal is a kind of like a backwater of spirituality that people have been too afraid to kind of to touch for too long. But actually the connections with ecology and the connections with the way that we deal with, live in, and interact with the world are really kind of stark and obvious once you start to think about it. It's all to do with relationships and how we interact with different kinds of minds and different kinds of worlds. It's really interesting stuff.
Well, I think that's that's something that's in the world of paranormal itself. You have like people who are like Wiccans, who have the magic and earth-based magic and things like that, who are very interested in ecology.
Yeah.
And it almost parallels the scientific community in that.
Yeah.
Then there's the side of the paranormal that thinks that by using their electromagnetic field meters that they're doing Darwin's work out there.
Yeah.
And so you have the difference between the two.
Yeah, definitely.
And so finding ways to bring them more together, where we can have these conversations and say like, well, this is the environment which is creating the swamp gas that's causing these experiences. Hey,
I have to interject too that because you mentioned Wicca, that one of the side projects I'm working on is why I'm so frazzled is we have in our hometown there's a beaver problem apparently, and the local public works director wants to just euthanize them, but I'm working with others to try to get them relocated in the best way possible. And when I reached out for help, one of the persons I reached out to was Selena Fox, our high priestess here in Wisconsin. And she's been on the show before. And so she was like the first person to get back to me and think about it seriously and reach out to others in her network to try to help me relocate these beavers. And so she, as far as taking it seriously, you don't think, oh, I'm going to call the witch now to help me out, but maybe you should, because those are the people that make magic by getting things done, and so there's a definite connection there among the witches, and I've got to, of course, mention the Fae because they hate when you don't mention them.
Yeah, very wise, sensible.
There you go. So I got to say thank you, Jack, for spending your time with us today, and thank you for sharing your wisdom and your open mind and everything like that with the See You on the Other Side community. We absolutely appreciate that. This new book coming out, I want you to check it out. It's going to be in the show notes. You're going to be able to grab your copy. We're going to link directly to it. Engaging the Anomalous. Collected essays on anthropology, the paranormal, mediumship, and extraordinary experience by Dr. Jack Hunter. You guys are going to love it. I've been reading it all weekend and enjoying it. Don't be scared by the academic part of it. It's pretty easy to read, and you're going to hear some really cool stories. So I heartily recommend it.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Allison and Jack, for joining me in that conversation. Hope everybody got something out of it.
Yes, thanks. And Mike, are you feeling ready to investigate now?
Yes, I am. I
am too.
I feel like after talking to him, he gives me hope, because sometimes you talk to paranormal investigators, and I hate to be like this, but sometimes you talk to paranormal investigators and you're just like, oh God, like this is the same thing, and some of it's a little too woo-woo for me, and I don't believe it kind of stuff. And then you get to talk to academics who are trying some different things and trying to have a scientific perspective, and then trying to actually use journal articles and academia and everything to forward the cause. And that gives me hope for the future.
Me too. And we've been doing more and more investigating ourselves ever since we started this podcast even. And so it's just, I like to have, being a science-minded person myself, I really like having that end of it covered.
Right.
It is obviously a field where we don't have all of the tools to be able to explore things scientifically. So some of it does require that you just go based on feelings and emotions and stuff like that. But boy, is it nice to have that evidence, and have other things to back it up.
Yeah.
It's good stuff.
And I think Jack's point, and he talks about this in the book, really that when you try to look at all perspectives and try not to just reduce it down to one explanation, and that's really what his ontological flooding, that's what this Engaging the Anomalous book is about. And so if you guys are interested in even if you're just interested in anthropology, even if you just like to read books about people who used to live with indigenous tribes and peoples and things like that in the world, you're going to get something out of this book. So
great.
That's my recommendation.
All right.
When it's coming down to songs that are in the same vein as this conversation, when you read the first, just the introduction to Engaging the Anomalous, what struck me right away was how difficult a path this is for an academic to take. For a researcher, for a scientist, for someone who cares about studying things, this is not the easiest subject to talk to other academics about. And
That's for sure.
I really respect it. Dr. Hunter, what a sweet, first of all, that would be, if I was a doctor, I'd want to be something like Dr. Hunter. Sounds like he should have
It's
his own
so perfect.
his own comic book. He wants to get his own comic book where he's investigating paranormal phenomena with indigenous peoples all over the world, and I would read that comic book.
That would be perfect.
But it's a hard thing to do, and you are up against like 90% of a community that doesn't, that's really interested in this stuff, but doesn't want to admit it. That's something that Dr. Radin talked about in the last episode. He's like, well, when I talk and I say, who's interested in psychic phenomena, every single person raises their hand. And then he goes, how many people are going to admit to researching it? And nobody raises their hands. So you're really up against the wall, and it's a tough thing to do. And we thought that was perfect for a Sunspot song about what happens when you do the hardest thing you possibly can. And Wendy, what's that song?
The song is The Path of Most Resistance.
Turn it up. I should have been an athlete, but my knees were too weak. I should have been a scholar instead of a pub crawler. I should have moved to California like the Chili Peppers said. I should have read more Tony Robbins and tried to get ahead. Every time I try, I fail. I'm Jonah and I'm stuck inside this weight of the time we'll never have together. Oh, it's me on the path of most resistance. Carry on banging my head against the wall. In the world at shiny distance, there's no safety net, and I'm in free fall. I should have been a rocker, but never took my chances. I'm finally on my own now, like Apple Piggy's glasses. Some days I'm just miserable, and others I feel both. I should have been something special, but instead I just got hurt. Every time I try, I fail. I'm Jonah and I'm stuck inside this weight of the time we'll never have together. Oh, it's me on the path of most resistance. Carry on banging my head against the wall. Keep the world at shouting distance. There's no safety net, and I'm in free fall. It's unacceptable, it's unreliable, incredible, unjustifiable. I'm in crisis mode and always on the run. Starbucks to wake up, pass out to kettle one. Have you tasted loco? Your mom will let you go. You can't sit still, you can't think. Worst case scenario. I have melancholy. I love because my love, my fingers on the button. That's a self-destruct. Every time I try, I fail. I'm Jonah and I'm stuck inside this weight of the time we'll never have together. Oh, it's me on the path of most resistance. Carry on banging my head against the wall. Keep the world at shouting distance. There's no safety net, and I'm in free fall. I love to flirt with failure. I love to make it tough. Take the hardest way, close but not close enough. On the path of most resistance. Carry on banging my head against the wall. Keep the world at shouting distance. There's no safety net, and I'm in free fall.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. You can find us online at OthersidePodcast.com. Until next time, see you on the other side.
Ooh, we can't forget to say thanks to our good friend Dr. Ned.
That's right. Dr. Ned is a Patreon superhero. He's at the level where he gets a special shout out in every single episode. So thank you, Dr. Ned. And thank you to our entire Patreon community.
Oh my gosh.
And
yes.
We're going
Thank
to
you.
be seeing them. What, Wendy, I can't remember. When are we only be seeing these guys again?
Mike, you got to get it on your calendar huge here. It's Wednesday, May 9th at 7:30 Central Time. We're all going to be hanging out, and it's going to be a blast. I can't wait.
Okay, all right. I am putting it on my calendar huge right now. In fact, I'm not even using the dry erase board marker. I'm using permanent.
Oh my
permanent
gosh.
marker, so I do
Okay.
not forget.
Good job. And if anybody wants to join us for that, it's not too late. You can join the community even right now today.
That's right.
At OthersidePodcast.com/donate. So thanks for listening and have a great week.
All right, what's up, Jack?
What's up, Jack?
Oh, no. We say, what's up, Doc?
Oh my God.
Because he's a doctor now.